Good morning and good afternoon to all from Santiago, Chile. We greet you from this venue of Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. We welcome you to this press conference and we will present the preliminary overview of the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean 2023. This is being held face to face and virtually through Zoom platforms, live or CEPAL.org, YouTube, and the webpage www.cepal.org, and all these social media. We greet those of you who are here in Celso Furtado room and the journalists that have registered to participate in situ or virtually, as well as ECLAC colleagues. Welcome. This conference, this launch will be headed by the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, José Manuel Salazar-Xirinachs, and he is with the Director of the Economic Development Division of our institution, Mr. Daniel Tiegelman, main person responsible for this report, and also Javier Medina and Cabinet Chief Silvia Hernandez, and also we have economic officials of the Economic Development Division. Cecilia Beira, Ramon Pineda, Manuel Pérez, Esteban Pérez, and Francisco Villarreal. After the presentation, we'll have a Q&A round. All questions of journalists, please send your questions in writing to the email conferenciaprensa@cepal.org. Those who are in Zoom, link to the chat. You can send us your concerns and comments and questions. So without further information, Executive Secretary, the floor is yours. Thank you, Guido. Good morning to everyone here in the room and those with us virtually. This is our last report of this year. It is the preliminary overview of the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean 2023. Here in this document, ECLAC presents estimates for the close of the year for the main economic variables of the countries of the region, the international context, global liquidity, external sector, economic activity, prices, employment, macroeconomic policy, and something very important, how do we envision 2024? Projections, forecasts. All these projections and estimates are a review presented in the Economic 2023 study, and in general, they reflect all the trends that we have identified in the last 3 months. In this preliminary overview, we show that the region will keep a low growth path next year, sluggish global growth. And this is a situation that will translate into decrease of employment and slowdown, and with costs in gender gaps and other effects in the labor market. It also shows that the growth of economies of Latin America and the Caribbean will be less than that observed in 2022. However, although all subregions will show less growth in 2023 as compared to 2022, there is significant heterogeneity among the different regions. The document has 8 chapters, and for this presentation, we'll summarize in 3 parts. One, the international economic global context, a summary of the regional juncture, regional context, and the third part with policy recommendations in view of trends and data that we will be presenting. Before proceeding, our thanks to Daniel Titelman and the whole team that has just been mentioned.
I would like to present the first part, the global context, and subsequently I'll offer the floor to Daniel Titelman so that he can present the other two parts of the report. And after that, we, of course, will answer the questions that you may ask. Now, with regards to the global context, basically three trends that I would like to mention. There are others, but these are the fundamental ones. There is sluggish global growth that we will document, stagnant world trade of goods, and also a very important characteristic of the context, which is because it implies a major change compared to the situation existing in practically 2 decades prior to the pandemic shock, which is a high financial costs in global markets, which contribute to an important restriction for fiscal policies and for the fiscal space, and thus for development efforts. In this graph, you can see the growth rates of the global economy. If we begin with the left-hand side, which is for the world as a whole, the world economy is expected to grow at a rate of 3% in 2023 and 2.9% in 2024 in accordance to the IMF. Now, these are growth rates that are below the historical average of 3.8 that existed between 2000 and 2019, which was 3.8%. If we look at a breakdown in advanced economies, there'll be a slowdown of 2.6 in 2022 to 1.5 in 2023 and to 1.4 in 2024, with a performance that is slightly better for the US, but a little worse for the European Union. In the US, the economy continues to be more resilient than expected. Growth projections for 2023 have been reviewed to 2.1 in 2023, despite the restrictive monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. Private consumption has remained strong in the third quarter, together with the strength of labor markets and the resilience of consumption in the US is also explained by the fact that increases in policy rates have resulted in effective average rates for households, but these have increased, and it is expected that this trend, together with the end of accumulated savings in households during the pandemic and a growth in salaries and employment, will lead to these projections for 2024, and therefore we expect a slowdown in the US economy of 1.5% in 2024. In the European Union, we expect a growth of only 0.7% for this year and 1.5% for next year. Part of this low performance is the result of the fact that the persistently high inflation and the restrictive monetary policy continue to have a strong impact upon the level of activity in European Union countries. And also there are countries, fundamental countries such as Germany, for example, where a very low performance is expected. In emerging and developing economies, there will be a slight reduction in net growth from 4.1 to 4%, both for 2023 and 2024. And in that country, China, which is the second trading partner in the region, will have a slower growth compared to the projections during midway this year as a result of the real estate sector and its implications for the economy. Now we expect a 5% growth in 2023 and 4.2% for 2024, below what was forecasted last July, but well above the growth of 2022, when the economy was suffering the impacts of the COVID policies. And that is the summary of the world context. Aligned with that slowdown that we have just mentioned, the World Trade Organization reviewed in October its projection of the volume of trade in 2020 through the demand for imports has been impacted by an increase of the costs of the debt in many advanced economies, and together with the Chinese real estate problems and increasing geopolitical tensions, that has impacted the prospects of trade in accordance with the WTO. The WTO expects that trade will increase by 0.8% this year, or at least that is what was expected when this was published a couple of months ago. But after these 2 months, we can say with that projection will not become a reality, because we have observed a drop of minus 2.2 in the accumulated between January and September versus the same period in the previous year, and therefore for 2024 the WTO has basically the same growth projection of 2.2, but the results of the world trade is not all that favorable, despite the fact that there will be a slight recovery next year. The drop in the price of basic prices, where you can see the interest rates, but interest rates remain high in developed countries, and this is one of the debates and discussions that is in the press in terms of when central banks should have begun, or at what speed, in light of the reduction in interest rates, reduce their monetary rates. The drop of prices in basic goods has been a key element, together with inflation, together with the normalization of pressures on supply chains, and in accordance with observers of supply chains at a world level, they have less pressure than what was evidenced before the pandemic. In other words, there is a normalization there. It is expected that average inflation rate at a world level will be reduced from 8.7% in 2022, 6.9% in 2023, and 5.8% in 2024, which is still higher than the 3.6% average of the decade prior to the pandemic. And inflation continues in general to be over and above the goals established by the main central banks. And as a result of that, monetary authorities have chosen to maintain a restrictive approach. And that is what we can see on the graph on the right-hand side, how interest rates have increased since September 2021 to November 2023, and how they are at a very high level. In the case of the US, inflation is expected to be 4.1% in 2023. In the Eurozone, that has also dropped compared to 2022. However, it would still be above the goal of 3% established by the Federal Reserve in the US and by the European Central Bank. The Federal Reserve in the US has increased interest rates in 525 basis points since this upward trend began in March 2022, and in the last meeting of November left that level unchanged. The European Central Bank also left its policies unchanged in the last October meeting at a level of 4%, after increasing that during 10 consecutive times to 550 basis points since the present restrictive cycle began. Now, here we can see on the left-hand side graph the performance of treasury bonds in the US in a 10-year period. In the blue line on the bottom, and there we find the performance of sovereign bonds of several emerging countries. And this is clear evidence of the greater costs of financing as a result of the continuous increases in interest rates. On the right-hand side, you can see the drop in the portfolio flows to emerging markets since 2016, and you can see the net outflow of these portfolio flows, which coincides with a greater demand for dollars and an appreciation of the dollar at a world level. And so, in summary, from what has been presented, we see a global economy that grows slowly with high financial costs and with a drop in capital flows towards emerging economies. And finally, and in order to make a transition of this economic overview, not from the world, but to the region, that will be presented by Daniel, here we can see a chart with the cost of external financing for government and how this has risen. We see sovereign debt emissions in dollars of 15 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and you can see the amounts and the interest rates. And how can we see the sovereign issues have experienced higher interest rates on average in 2021? The average rate was 3.6%. In 2022, it rose to 4.9%, and by September 2023 to 6.3%, which is clear evidence of the increase in the cost of financing and the impact that that has in terms of reducing the fiscal space. And now I'd like to offer the floor to Daniel. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Moving ahead, well, the Executive Secretary was illustrating that the region faces a global context which is quite complex, with low growth, low dynamic of the trade in goods, and an increased and sustained and probably permanent increase of financial costs that in financial markets that the region can gain access to, and that limits fiscal space and the space for macroeconomic policy in general for countries in the region. And that forms part of the context of this region. And within that context, the region will continue the movement of low economic growth that ECLAC has been warning about for a while now, and that is indeed one of the major challenges, how to revert this trajectory of low growth. And this low growth path implies a weaker job creation, the persistence of labor informality, and difficulties in terms of bridging gender gaps in labor markets. And now behind this economic growth, as has been expressed by ECLAC on several occasions, the very low investment dynamic, low investment rates, and also a less labor productivity, as ECLAC has also emphasized. That underlines this weak performance of growth in the region, and which is indeed one of the challenges faced by the region. And as has been mentioned, external and internal dynamics have led to limited space for fiscal policies and for monetary policy measures linked to its ability to do things, linked to what happens in the global context and in international financial markets. And that is the context within which we are making these projections and submitting these figures. And within this context, this year, there will be a continued slowdown in economic growth compared to what we experienced in 2021 and 2022. And as you can see here, following a slight recovery in the first quarter of this year compared to the same quarter of the previous year, we find a drop compared to the first quarter of 2021, and we continue to evidence a slowdown in the economic growth of the region in the second and third quarter of this year at a quarterly level. And that already points to the fact, as was mentioned by the Executive Secretary during his introduction, that the region has a dynamic of low growth, and we are observing a slowdown in the growth both this year and next year as well. This low growth, as has already been mentioned, is translated into a weaker job creation and a smaller labor participation. On the left-hand side, you can see the rate of growth, the interannual variation in terms of the number of employed, and you can see that after the post-COVID recovery, where in 2020 this dropped by nearly 8%, and that recovered strongly in 2021. Last year, it grew at a rate of around 5.4%, and this year there is already a significant slowdown in terms of job creation, and it is expected that this year it will grow to 1.4%, and next year to only 1%. And this is the result of the lower dynamic performance. And on the right-hand side, what you can see is a drop in the labor force participation, and that implies that there are fewer people seeking employment. And since there's fewer people seeking employment, there is more people that are outside the labor market. And that is also the result of the economic dynamics where there is less expectation of finding jobs, and people often withdraw from this search.
And that, of course, is translated into many people focus in informal employment, and informality levels in labor force markets is 47, 48 in average, close to 50% of informality in labor markets. That is one of the main structural challenges of the region historically, and it's changing with all the challenges and technological changes. And on the graph of the right, we can see the gender gap in terms of participation, and you can see the first semester of this year, 22 percentage points is the gender gap, and that has kept stable around that figure. And it's difficult, and ECLAC has raised in many opportunities the topic of including women in the labor economy, in the economy of care, and it's going to be central to close gender gaps, and also as a dynamic factor for our economies. And those are the challenges of countries ahead. As to fiscal space, as the executive secretary said, when financing costs go up of the sovereign debt, the fiscal space of our countries remains limited. Here, primary deficit, global deficit, and the dynamics of expenditures for Latin America. And the expenditure level this year regarding the previous one went to 21.8, whilst the revenue level went down from 19.3 GDP points to 18.3. And this translated into an increase of primary deficit. We went from a surplus of 0.3% last year. Now we expect a deficit of 0.6%. And also the global deficit that goes minus 2.3 to 3.3. And the difference between primary deficit of minus 0.6 and the global one of minus 0.33 is because of the payment of interest rates of the debt, and the increase of international financial expenditures limits this fiscal space. On the right side, we show the dynamics of total revenue of central government for the region. And tax revenue went down from 16.2 to 15.8. It is a significant one if measured in money terms. It's important. And that explains part of the dynamic of primary deficit or global deficit that we were considering. In the case of the Caribbean, it is expected that the primary surplus will go from 0.3 to 0.7 this year. And that reflects a drop in the expenditure going from 20.8 to 29.3, and a drop in revenue of 27.4 to 27% of GDP. This primary surplus in the Caribbean contrasts with the global one of minus 2.4, and the difference is the high burden of debt interest payments of the countries of the Caribbean. On the right side graph, the Caribbean countries have adjusted the current expenditure from 21.5 to 20.8 points of so as to account for the increase that went from 2.7 to 3.0%. This is the developmental distress. That is when the debt servicing consumes too many resources in the fiscal space and countries cannot invest in social protection, social policies, or investments. You need to invest more in the payment of the debt. And here in the Caribbean, there is an adjustment of the primary uh, expenditure. the debt level in the context of high financial cost is high. It has gone down from the maximum of 56% in the pandemic in the central government for Latin America. Now we are close to 50%. They are still very high historically. And you can see particularly how it has gone up in spite of the fact it has gone down in the last year. And in the context of high costs, these debt levels become more complex. Many countries will have to refinance, reissue debt in order to pay for part of the interests. And that will be done in the context of higher costs than originally. On the right side, in the Caribbean case, a high level of debt 87% in 2020 to today it's around 70%. But these are high debt levels that limit the capacity of development of Caribbean countries. And there is more propaganda. ECLAC has proposed a resilience fund for the Caribbean in order to face the external debt of the Caribbean as a central element that will be taken up in the discussion. How to link the debt relief with the development, not only how to improve the fiscal capacity of serving the debt, but how the reliefs generated in interest payments allow for improving the capacity of countries to invest in their development trajectories. The high levels of debt have led to an increase to higher interest payments in the region, reducing fiscal space. On the left side graph, the average of Latin America in 2012, interest payment was 1.7% of GDP. In 2022, that is 2.6% of GDP. And if you think we are living in a world where financial costs will be significantly higher than known and in more permanent manner, one would think that that trajectory would grow up. And it's complex. In the case of Caribbean, it continues to be high, although it went from 3.2 to 2.7% of GDP. And that improvement is the result of debt restructuring of some countries like Jamaica, Barbados, and others. But they are very high levels. And if you see the variance, there are countries in Latin America that even get to 5 points of GDP. 5 points of the production effort is to pay interest debts. And one would wonder if those 5 points were allocated to productive development, social policies, and others, what would the impact be on growth and development of our countries? That is somewhat the main dilemma that we have raised and has been defined as developmental distress. To separate the subject from the pressures of the debt on the fiscal space and the need of debt servicing, it's an impact on growth and development long term. I'm showing here how part of fiscal revenue and tax revenue, today the payment of interest accounts for 18% of what governments collect in average. 18% coming from taxes are allocated to debt interest payments. And on the right, we can see what today versus 2012, interest payments is 63% of the spending in education. As the executive secretary said, the major challenge of really taking charge of the losses of training, education, and the pandemic, all these resources could be allocated to recover education systems. In the case of health, it is equivalent to 64% of the expenditure in health. In social protection, 54. And in the case of public investments, which is highly worrisome, almost doubles it. So this is to show you the dilemmas or trade-offs that you have in resource allocation sometimes. As to monetary policy, the great news is in the region, inflation also is declining. and we go from a peak of 8.2% inflation close to November of 2022 to what estimated one of 3.8 for the closing of this year average, and an estimated inflation for the next year 3.1 or 3.2. So there is a declining trend of inflation, and this trajectory in Latin America and the Caribbean has specific conditions in each country, but a common feature is commodity, energy, food, and oil are declining. And if they continue to decline, then the inflation will keep this downward trend. This has led to what is that many countries in the region, Paraguay, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Chile, and Costa Rica, the inflation expectation and Brazil are also going down, and inflation forecasts are within the target ranges of central banks, so therefore generates more space for monetary policies to maintain the drops in interest rates. There are other countries where inflation expectations are still above the target ranges of a central bank like Uruguay, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. One would expect greater caution, greater slowness in the reduction of interest rates. And this can be seen here in general, with the exception of Guatemala, where the inflation expectations are within the target ranges, have started to reduce their interest rates, monetary policy. Brazil went from 13.75 to 12.75, Chile from 11.25 to 9, Uruguay from 11 to 9, and in general, countries are beginning a trajectory that have been slower in some than others, but one would expect that the trend of interest rates in the region for next year will have a declining trend in a significant part of countries. Other countries like Colombia, Mexico, Jamaica, and Guatemala, rates have not yet been moved, and the discussion is when to initiate a process of rate reduction or rate cuts. So, in this context of difficulties of the global economy, restrictions to policy spaces, fiscal space, monetary policy, and more structural problems in the region in terms of investment productivity, is that the growth projections, projected GDP growth rates, there is an average 2.2% less than that observed in the previous year. There has been a slowdown of growth in Latin America and the Caribbean this year as compared to 2022. This year we expect 2.2. As the executive secretary said, there is heterogeneity in sub-regions and countries as to growth. In the case of South America, 1.5% growth rate is expected. In Central America without Mexico, 3.4. In the case of Caribbean without Guyana, 3.4%. This heterogeneity is not new. Since the subprime crisis, we can observe a heterogeneity in subregions. But a characteristic of all subregions and of all countries is that there is a slowdown process in the growth dynamics. One will come from a higher plateau, others from a lower plateau. But there is a slowdown dynamics in all the countries and regions when compared, with some exceptions, of course, but when compared to 2022. As for next year, it is also expected that this growth slowdown we expect 1.9% for 2024. Heterogeneity among countries in South America, 1.4, in Central America and Mexico, 2.7, Central America without Mexico, 3.2. In the case of Caribbean, excluding Guyana because of oil, a growth rate of 2.6. Once again, with heterogeneity and countries growing more than others, Venezuela growth around 4%, Paraguay 3.8, contraction in Argentina, heterogeneity.
But the common factor is the slowdown of growth, and that is one of the issues that is of greatest concerns beyond the specific context in the region, because despite the fact that it will be 2.2 this year and 2.9 next year, what is of greatest concern, and this was mentioned by the executive secretary, is that the region has evidenced a permanent drop in the growth of the trend of the growth trend, and this shows the dynamics of the growth, which was 5.5%, and between 2080 and 2000, between 1980 and 20 in the year 2000, it was. Well, it is now 1.6% beyond the context, and one views the slowdown of growth, the and the different in these periods. So the big challenge of the region is how to change this drop in the trend growth, so which is an estimation that one finds in many countries is a drop in the in this trend growth, and this is very low in many countries, and this is a way of approaching that potential product which in many of our countries is very low. This implies neither optimism nor pessimism, but rather implies a tremendous challenge for us all. It implies that we have to develop policies and develop many things in order to revert this trend. And this trend also has implications for the GDP per capita. And you can see that in 2023, Latin America, despite the slow growth, albeit growth, it was only in 2023. It is only in 2023 that it will recover the per capita GDP of 2013. And this is important because it implies the quality of life of people. And now, in order to conclude, I'd like to mention some issues related to policies and related to the strategic challenges that ECLAC has put forward. And this also refers to other presentations delivered by the Executive Secretary to other documents of ECLAC that have also put forward this strategic vision. One of the major challenges that the region faces without prioritizing is the increase of investment in Latin America. Latin America and the Caribbean is a region that invests less compared to 2024 in developed countries, and 38.7%, for example, in terms of emerging and developing Asia. So the region faces a major challenge in terms of making a quantum leap in terms of investments, a challenge that is also deepened and magnified if we account for the challenges of climate change that will demand a large amount of investment in order to face up to that climate change in a region that invests little and that has a low stock of capital goods, so which is around 65% of the GDP, which is compared to practically 92% in emerging markets and 115% in the low-income developing countries. And if one breaks down the dynamics of growth, was saying that the trend growth has been dropping, we can see that the total productivity of sectors has not contributed to growth. In fact, it has been negative since the beginning of this century, and basically the result of accumulation. In other words, as a result of the investment and the dynamics of job creation and the contributions of capital and labor. And this has been very, very weak, and therefore growth has also been very weak, which is the result of what that is shown in this graph. And thus the major challenge is how to recover investment and the total productivity of sectors, and how to recover labor productivity. As you can see on the right-hand side, this year it is still below the labor productivity of the 80s. And there we face a major challenge. And within that challenge, ECLAC calls for action, policies to dynamize inclusive and sustainable growth. And there, the main message, and the Executive Secretary has mentioned this on several occasions, is that we have to change our mindset and begin to think about active policies in different areas. We cannot continue to do the same and expect to grow at the same rate as we have been growing in the past. And in that sense, we have to make a change as from changing our growth paradigm, but also in terms of the policies that we have been introducing. And therefore, we need to expand to productive development policies, focusing on strategic sectors. And we will be discussing that aspect. We also need to adopt policies to boost public and private investment. So when the cycle is going down or up, countries must promote investments in order to make growth much more dynamic and sustainable. We also need to expand fiscal and monetary policy for resource mobilization, and that is closely linked to the dynamics of what happens in the world economy. That will also be important. And as a result of that, ECLAC, as the whole UN, have been presenting the need to reform the international financial and tax architecture in order to expand the policy space and domestic resource mobilization in the countries of the region. And we believe that those are guidelines that should guide, so to speak, the policy efforts for countries in the next few years. Here, I would like to mention or talk about a graph that we have often shown in ECLAC that identify sectors that drive sustainable growth and productive transformation. I'm not going to talk about each sector in view of time, but these are sectors that could be could be environmentally sustainable, that support actions towards related to climate change, sustainable tourism, digital government, and so on and so forth. But what we seek to say with this is that we have to identify investment opportunities, we must identify strategic sectors, and we must have productive transformation policies to funnel resources to those sectors that drive the economy. And within that, and that effort must be accompanied by a framework of macroeconomic and financial policies that enable us to mobilize the resources that we need to generate and funnel in that direction. And we have talked about different spaces here. First of all, we need to expand the fiscal space, and that leads us to strengthen the collection and progressivity of the tax structure in many of our countries. We need to make the budget much greener in terms of tax and expenditure. We need to gain access to debt relief mechanisms. So we need to manage financial and exchange rate risks in order to promote private investment in areas that help in the struggle against climate change. And there we have a big challenge for the monetary policy. We also need to have better concessional finance and development banking mobilization. And there we find the multilateral, regional, and national development banks, and also the mechanisms, as I mentioned, for related debt relief that will be important, as mentioned by the executive secretary. And therefore, in order to summarize, in 2023 and 2024, the economies of the region maintain this trend towards slower growth. It is important to overcome the region's trend growth. We must reverse that, and we, in this productive development policies that foster investment and productivity, we also need to have a wider fiscal and monetary space for domestic resource mobilization on what happens in the world, not only in terms of the growth of trade, but also in terms of the financial and tax architecture at an international level will play a very important role in terms of the capabilities that our countries have to mobilize the resources that are needed. And finally, as mentioned by the Executive Secretary on several occasions, what we want to do is to establish a virtuous circle between growth, social inclusion, and how to address climate change. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now, we will move on to the press conference with the round of questions and answers. These are some of the questions that we have received during the presentation. And we will also open up the floor for questions. But we have received a question, first of all, from the Reuters correspondent, Fabian Caldero, who asks, the report says that interest rates remain high despite the containment of inflation. Some countries of the region have started to reduce referentials. Could we go beyond the forecasts that we have for 2024? Does that factor imply that there will be an increase of projections in 2024? And the other question is whether the report highlights a reduction in job creation. Could that lead to protests or instabilities that could impact the development of economies? Yes, thank you very much, Fabian Candero. Obviously, despite the fact that most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, as reveal a drop in inflation as from the second half of 2022, monetary authorities in the region did not begin to relax the monetary policies until the first quarter of 2023. The reduction of rates, however, has been cautious in all countries, and again, that is linked to the fact that countries have a system of inflation goals and monetary rate policies are still above the levels evidenced before the pandemic, because that policy has been relaxed, but it is still restrictive in view of the fact that inflation rates are over and above the goals that have been established. This caution is the result of the fact that we still have an underlying inflation, and also due to considerations, and this is extremely important because of the big mobility of capital flows today, of maintaining certain proportions and certain distances, not too distant between the country rates and international rates. That could lead to uh, the exit of capital that seek higher levels of profitability, and therefore that has an impact. On top of that, we have considerations related to the uncertainties resulting from world geopolitics as a result of wars, and what that could still represent for energy prices and for food prices. And also, of course, there are climate issues, the El Nino effect and its impact upon the supply of food products. In consequence, in accordance with our projections, we envisage a reduction of monetary rate policies, but we'll see how that goes depending on the evaluations of central banks. Undoubtedly, if the magnitude and the speed of those adjustments were to speed up, that would stimulate the growth of economic activity. But of course, with a delay that characterizes the mechanisms to transmit monetary policies to the real economy. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Are there any concerns from members of the press present in the room? Because otherwise, we'll ask a question from the correspondent of Prensa Latina, Carmen Esquivel. She asks two questions. Carmen says the dynamics of growth will continue in Latin America and the Caribbean in 2023 and 2024 in accordance with the overview. Is this still a consequence of the pandemic, or which other factors are having an impact upon these indicators? And these projections of ECLAC about tourism in the region, given the fact that this is an important source of income for several countries in the region. The questions from Carmen Esquivel from the Prensa Latina press agency. Thank you, Carmen Esquivel, for your questions. Unfortunately, the low growth in 2023 and 2024 is no longer primarily due to the consequences of the pandemic, but rather a return to a syndrome of longer term slow growth of the region, as we have, and we have insisted on that. And that is precisely the result of what is illustrated in a very important graph presented by Daniel, entitled The Expected Low Growth for 2023 and 24 is not only a specific problem, but rather reflects the low growth of the low trend growth in the region. And as shown by that graph, in a period of 40 years, it was 5.5. During the following 30-year period, between 1980 and 2009, that was 2.7%, half of that of the previous year. And in the 14-year period between 2010 to date, that was 1.6%. And so this is an additional reduction of 1 percentage point for that long 14-year period compared to the previous 30 years.
What? So it's not a matter here of exaggerating things, but it is a tragedy if you don't use that word. It is a very serious problem of not having the capacity to grow at higher rates. And there are several factors indeed that explain this: low investment rates that we showed the graph, the deficits in education systems, and particularly the low growth of productivity and the low pace of productive development. That is why our insistence and one or the first recommendation in this. Of course, in the present juncture, the growth of the region is not helping. I mean, the low growth of world economy of the main trade partners or world global context, but the graph shows a trend to the reduction of potential growth long term and to these very diverse periods of performance of global economy. We're speaking about 70 years of reduction, and there have been a higher growth or higher. This is an endogenous problem. Now, if world economy was growing more, that would have a positive effect. As to tourism, in the first semester of 2023, the value of regional exports of tourism services grew at an interannual rate of 25.3% in the first semester of 2023. That is the recovery after the tremendous drop of tourism because of the pandemic and uh, crisis cascade. If there are no forecasts for the complete year, probably in the second semester there will be a slowdown as a result not only of the low economic growth generally and the recovery of tourism activity is quite advanced. So what is left is normal growth, not a rebound or people that had to defer trips and now they wanted to take up and was unable to do it for 2 or 3 years. Now, the arrival of international tourists in 2023 had exceeded the pre-pandemic levels. They were they were better than before the pandemic in Mexico and Central America, and about to reach that level in the Caribbean. They are the two sub-regions that generate the gross exports of, or 75% of that tourism services are there. Thank you to Paulina Abramovich. Now raises the following question. The new government of Javier Milei has announced the measures for the adjustment of the economy promised in his campaign, in a low growth in the region and a drop of 2.5% for this year in the country. How does ECLAC evaluate these measures? Are they the appropriate road because of the consequences on the well-being of the population? Paulina Abramovich of AFP agency. Thank you, Paulina, for your question. Argentina is in an economic situation of high vulnerability because of the accumulation of a series of microeconomic imbalances, not only of the previous government, it's rather a structural, long-term back. And those imbalances have led to an stagnation of the economy in the last decade, a drop of per capita GDP of 12% since 2011, to an inflationary process that's persistent. And according to the last measurement, in interannual inflation, 161 from November 22 to November 23. This week, the new government announced a series of measures that are designed to reduce rapidly the fiscal and external deficit that the president himself has mentioned as a shock treatment. Among them, these measures a rise in the official exchange rate of 100%, reduction of subsidies to energy and transportation, the modification of taxes on foreign trade, the reduction of transfers of resources to provinces, the reduction of expenditure in public works, the non-renewable of contracts in the public sector, and the suspension of advertising in media. Still, we don't know the calibration or the weight of each one of these measures, and this, of course, makes it difficult to say something or about the numbers or impacts. But as details are defined for each one of those measures, what can be foreseen and the president himself has announced is an initial inflationary process that will have impacts in the whole economy, all social sectors, but mainly the most vulnerable ones. The Argentinian government announced a series of uh, revenue compensation measures, like a 100% increase in benefits of universal allocation program per child, also in the food program, announcing that other programs, social programs like potential work and others will be maintained. From ECLAC, we are following the evolution of the Argentinian economy in the next weeks and months. The success of these announced measures will depend to a great extent that they be effective in balancing public accounts and international accounts in one first stage. Of course, the economy is not a machine that works automatically. It is inserted in a social and political reality, and also the effectiveness of measures and what happens in the coming months will depend on the reaction of different economic players in order to overcome the very harsh and complex period through which the country is about to tread before measures generating a new reality or a new, more stable economic order. If measures are successful, fiscally and externally, it can set the basis to reduce the high levels of inflation afterwards, and with the instruments and implementation of supplementary measures. I would say this is what can be said. Currently, of the measures announced 4 years back. Thank you. Uh, Gisela Salomon of Associated Press, who raises the following questions. The impact of economic slowdown in the region. How should countries act in order to palliate that social impact at times with very small budgets? And what country is more vulnerable? Those are the questions of Gisela Salomon, Associated Press Agency. Thank you, Gisela. As we said in our last social panorama for Latin America and the Caribbean 2023, in 1922, it went back to the pre-pandemic levels. 29% of people in situation of poverty, 181 million persons, and 11.2 in situation of extreme poverty, 70 million persons. The economic growth rate expected for 2023 and 2024 does not allow to foresee high improvements in the poverty situation. With that scenario, the social spending that increased as a response to the pandemic and reached its peak in 2020 has declined since then. And that therefore prevents a more determining response from the world of from the social world and active labor market policies. An important challenge is to reach financial sustainability of social expenditure and strengthen the policies of inclusive social development. But as we have seen, there is a limited tax or fiscal space, and therefore we need to expand the fiscal space to respond, and therefore mobilization of resources, internal and external, are so important. And as we know, one of the effective ways to expand those spaces, to broaden them, is through tax reforms or international reforms and debt restructuring that will open up that fiscal space. And the other measure is to make labor markets more dynamic, leading to economic growth for creation of employment, reducing poverty and informality. And we have insisted in that subject of productive development. They are highly connected. They are not separate worlds. Not all the social can be solved with social policy. It calls for better labor market and economic dynamism policies. Gisela also asked about what is the most vulnerable country, or, well, it's very difficult. Look, the concept of vulnerability has many definitions. So if you think about vulnerability to climate change, there's broad consensus in that Caribbean countries are the most vulnerable to climate change. If its country is vulnerable to higher interest rates or higher costs of financing, well, those who are really overwhelmed by debt servicing would be the most vulnerable ones to that. Those that are more vulnerable to this low uh, economic growth rate of 0.7, the EU, are the ones that have the EU, the European Union, as the most important trade partner. It will depend on the definition of vulnerability. Now the question from Agencia F, Maria Moore. Two questions. The first one refers to the Argentinian situation that we have already addressed before. So I will refer to the first of those questions. For 2024, a growth rate lower than 2023 is expected, and therefore slowdown of GDP. Are there prospects of when this situation will be reversed, or Latin America is heading to prolonged stagnation? That is the question of Maria Mood from Agencia F. Thank you, Maria, for the question. And in fact, we don't have a crystal ball, but the message is it's not that Latin America is doomed to permanent stagnation. The message is that Latin America and the Caribbean have to do many, many things in order to reinvigorate growth. And if those things are done, and if international economic context improves, world trade and financial issues, and Latin America starts doing the homework it has to do, we would expect that growth once again will be more dynamic and will be observing an acceleration of growth and not a slowdown. So Latin America has to do many efforts in order to face the structural problems involved in its growth dynamics, investment, productivity, low investments, and I would say that the message is we haven't projected 2025. In a few months, we'll be able to. But the substantive message is to avoid the dynamics of stagnation. The region has to expand its policy space. It has to begin productive development policies and reverse this stagnation. Thank you, Daniel Titelman. I now refer to the concerns of María José Núñez.
Of Seminario Universidad de San José in Costa Rica. First of all, whether you could talk about the situation of Central American countries and especially of Costa Rica. And this refers to the projections for this and next year that have been mentioned in the overview. Thank you, María José Núñez from Semanario Universidad. With regards to Central America, we estimate that for 2023, the economies of Central America will have an average growth rate of 3.4, as mentioned in one of the graphs, and that is lower than 4.8 in 2022, primarily as a result of a slowdown in foreign trade and a weaker domestic consumption. Now, interest rates have meant that countries have postponed investment projects, and consumption is also less dynamic, and has also impacted. What has also impacted is the phenomenon of El Nino, especially in the agricultural sector. For 2024, we estimated that Central American economies will grow on average 3.2 as a result of less growth with the main trade partners. And for 2023, ECLAC estimated that the GDP, the real GDP in Costa Rica, would grow by 4.9%, practically 5% in 2023 compared to 4.6% in 2022. In other words, a slight improvement, an important rate. And this estimate represents a significant improvement with regards to predictions that we have mentioned at the beginning of the year, and this is a result of the surprising growth of the exports of goods and services despite the slowdown of world trade and the world economy. Costa Rica was positioned in certain value chains and in certain sectors that are very dynamic, medical devices and the export of modern services that are not typical and do not represent the average of the world trade, but sectors that are growing very dynamically. And that is a demonstration that when a country is adequately positioned in dynamic sectors, and that's our suggestion for growth driver or sectors that drive growth, well, that can be very beneficial for countries. And with regards to 2024, the real GDP in Costa Rica would be 3.8% as a result of the increase of the world trade and the world economy. There are several indicators, macro indicators, because this question also involved a comment. I mentioned that the expected growth is close to 5%, the second largest in Latin American countries. There's a significant improvement in terms of fiscal indicators, and this primarily due to a law that includes a fiscal rule and other measures passed in 2018, and that has established rules so that there is no automatic indebtedness, and the fiscal expenditure, the inflation rate also slowed down, and the exports in goods and services will expand to two-digit rates. In terms of employment, the data that we have not positive or as positive as expected. The unemployment rate has been notably reduced, but that is primarily due to a lower rate of labor participation. The working population in October 23 was 2.6 million versus a similar figure in 2022. And part of the issue in Costa Rica is that there is a dualistic type of economy where there are very dynamic modern sectors that promote that growth, but most of the employment and most of the labor force work in non-tradable sectors geared towards the domestic market, and therefore there is no such a big growth there, despite the 4 or 5% growth of the economy. But this is not the two-digit growth of the exports of these dynamic sectors. I think we could maybe make additional comment, but I would say that those are the main things. So there was also a second question about whether we're viewing that trend in Costa Rica, also present in other countries. What happens is that each economy is very specific. It's very difficult to say this same thing is happening elsewhere. We can find certain elements that are similar. There are certain realities of Costa Rica, not only its size, but the fact that it has some dynamic sectors that make it fairly similar to Uruguay. And Uruguay, I would say that there are fairly similar trends in dynamic sectors, and some of the things that I have just mentioned about Costa Rica, the same can be said of the Dominican Republic. But comparing Costa Rica with Mexico, Argentina, or Brazil doesn't really make too much sense, because there are orders of magnitude and orders of structural characteristics and of economic sizes that are very different. Thank you, Executive Secretary. The next question is from Mexico. Yvette Saldaña, a journalist from El Universal in Mexico, and she asks about the factors that are of greatest concern with regard to the performance of the Mexican economy in 2024, and how important will be the increase in the deficit in order to the indebtedness to pay for current expenditure. Thank you, Yvette, for your question. Indeed, for this year in ECLAC, we're projecting a growth of 3.6 in Mexico, and for next year, 2.5% growth in Mexico. Now, what is behind this slowdown in growth projections? Well, on the one hand, as has been mentioned, the slowdown in the growth of the US plays a very important role when it comes to the Mexican economy. And this year, the US has had a performance in terms of economic resilience, which has been greater than the expectations. But for next year, there'll be a slowdown in the growth rate in the US, and that, of course, will have an impact upon the economy of Mexico, and not only the slowdown of the US economy, but also of the world as a whole. And we have seen trade projections in that sense, and therefore there will be in a more complex international context that will impact the the growth dynamics of our countries. But because Mexico is very close to the US, well, that's an important factor. Another factor that could impact our growth next year have to do with the flow of foreign investment. And we're viewing that in the international context, that could also be less than this year. And again, that could be a factor that could impact the growth dynamics next year. And a third factor that is also relevant in the case of Mexico refers to the availability of production inputs, given the importance of the exporting sector for the Mexican economy. And there we have to see how value chains develop and the production of these inputs. Now, with regards the fiscal dynamics, indeed, between January and October of this year, budgetary collections have increased by 4% in real terms compared to the same period of the previous year, between January and October of 2023 and of 2022. Now, this increase was as a result of an increase of non-oil revenues, which increased by nearly 4.8%, a drop in oil revenues, and also that budgetary expenditure of the public sector increased by around 2% in real terms. And this was primarily the result of the increase of transfers from the federal governments to the states of around 2.2%. Current expenditure increased by 3.3%, and the financial costs, given the high rates of international interest rates, increased by 26%. And that was combined with a drop in capital expenditure, which is of concern, of 0.85%, and that led to the public deficit this year to a level of around 675 billion, greater than in 2022, which was around 400 billion. In September of this year, the finance ministry submitted to Congress the economic package for 2024, which does not include substantial modifications to taxes, but an increase in the indebtedness ceiling. that would reach a total of 4.9% of the GDP in order to conclude the public works of this government, such as the Maya train and the refinery of Los Boques. And this greater deficit will mean that the sovereign total debt in Mexico will be a high percentage of the GDP, but this debt is still in a sustainable trajectory as and it is important to highlight that in general terms of the past few years, Mexico has conducted a very sober and careful fiscal policy, and therefore that deficit will probably begin to be reduced by 2025. We thank Daniel Titelman. Then we have two final questions in view of the time that we have scheduled for this press conference. There are others, and we will be answering them by other means. Bastias from the Italian press agency ANSA asks, would ECLAC highlight a country in Latin America or the Caribbean that is doing things well and that can say, well, you have to look in that direction, or the international uncertainty makes it impossible to show an example of this type? That is a question from ANSA, expressed by Margarita Bastias. And the preliminary overview seems to be very bleak, really. Well, beginning with the comment before the question that we have presented a disheartening overview. Our idea is to make a diagnosis which is as objective as possible, so that as from there we can design or suggest evidence-based policies based on reality that enables the promotion of growth. And that is why we call countries to action in order to adopt policies to improve growth, to expand fiscal space, both at a domestic and international level, the strengthening of social expenditure in order to improve the social situation and the necessary transfers and so on. So, as explained, those are the messages that we are conveying. Now, in terms of countries that are having a positive performance, well, the data is eloquent. In the case of the northern part of the region, Costa Rica and Panama, or Panama and Costa Rica in that order, have the highest growth rates this year. I have already spoken at length about Costa Rica with a rate of around 5% and a significant improvement in fiscal indicators, a quick slowdown of inflation, very dynamic exports of goods and services. And in Panama, a growth of 6.1% is expected for this year, by the end of this year, which is the biggest among Latin American countries, despite the fact that the drought and the gradual elimination of subsidies will have an impact upon food prices and will increase, and an annual inflation is also expected of around 2%. And by August 23, there will be a significant reduction in open unemployment from 5.8 to 2.8, primarily due to this growth of nearly 6 percentage points. There are other countries where we also find an important heterogeneity. The overview talks about average. We have talked about sub-regions, but if we break this down into country level, there is a lot of heterogeneity, and some countries have had very positive performance. But I would say that we have to be careful and say that these countries, these results differentiated by countries, is not only the result of the macro situation. There are important structural differences between countries, and nor are they only due to the tasks undertaken by a single government. And that is equivalent to saying that not everything is simply a specific issue, but rather what are the specific development policies that countries have implemented in longer periods of time, especially structural reforms and the history of investment in education, the result of investments in education, is something that becomes evident in decades and not overnight, unless there is a pandemic, of course, as happened recently. But these are long-term issues.
Fiscales también.
Fiscal topics, I mean, in countries, if they have a healthy, sound fiscal situation, and countries that are lagging a fiscal structure that call for radical reforms. There's another structural factor there, and productive development policies. In the case of Costa Rica, Panama, Uruguay, Mexico has also had productive development policies, very strong ones, Brazil as well, but that changes gradually. And this is a classical topic in ECLAC and development. What is truly the diversification, sophistication, economic complexity, and that will determine different resiliences of economies vis-a-vis international shocks. So if we speak about growth rates, much has to do with the economic policy of the government in power, and also has to do what has been done in the last 20 and 30 years as state policies. And this is key because it's part of what Latin America should have more continuity in these subjects because the processes of growth, development, economic quality, these are cumulative topics in time. Thank you. Now, Olis Castro, uh, uh, from El País, Spanish paper. The Federal Reserve of the US maintained its rates without variation and is forecasting cuts for 2024. How can these announcements be received in Latin America and the Caribbean, and what to expect in our region? Maolis Castro from El País, Spain. Thank you, Maoli, for your question. And as you say, in the recent meeting of December 13th, the Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve maintained the rate without changes between 5.25 and 5.5%, and also sent a signal, and this is the highest level in the last 20 years, and sent a signal that if needed would be willing to increase if inflation had a rebound. And if the inflation continues to go down, they would reduce the tax, the rates. And the idea is that 2024 is that there will be a reduction of rates that would be around 4.7% for next year. It is a greater reduction than that forecasted in October. However, these rates continue to be high. And from the region's perspective, this has several effects. As the executive secretary mentioned at the beginning, when financial costs or financial markets go up, they limit the political or the policy space of our countries because the differential, rate differential of our economies and that of the US generates pressures on the exchange rate, in turn on the capital flows, and that limit the space where countries incorporate new considerations where central banks can act. Central banks not only adjust the interest rates of monetary policy based on inflation, but also has exchange considerations impacted by this differential of interest rates between our countries and Fed. There is an effect that is transmitted to financial markets, limiting the capacity of action in country by country in terms of the exchange dynamics, financial flow dynamics, and that of inflation as well. And that generates variables that central banks need to incorporate. And in some cases, it has limited the speed at which interest rates are going down. So there is less space for monetary policy in our countries. On the other hand, if it maintains financing costs high, if countries need to refinance their debts, they will find higher cost levels, and they have been growing for the last 2 years, about 6% this year, and the higher international financial cost limits the fiscal space of our economies. So there is an effect on our economies through fiscal space. And then finally, if the United States reduces rates and generates a reactivation of the US economy, that will have a positive impact on our economy through the real economy of remittances, exports, and that would be positive. So, to summarize, the effect on the financial markets that limits the capacity of our countries to reduce it or the speed to reduce interest rates, and therefore it has an effect on the monetary policy and its ability to stimulate growth. It has a financial effect on our public systems because of the cost of financing and on private investment as well because of cost of financing. But if there is a rebound of the US, then it will have a positive impact on our economies. Thank you, Daniel. We have exceeded the time allotted for this conference. That is why, dear colleagues of the media, more than 100 colleagues that have followed us virtually, plus those that have honored us with your physical presence. We won't keep on live answering your questions, but we have received the questions of Mirta Rodriguez, La Estrella from Panama, Daniel Salazar, Bloomberg, Clara Cepeda from La Jornada México, Paula Santibáñez, Valor Futuro de Chile, Gabriel Colín, TVN 23, Guatemala, and Luis Alberto Sierra, responding of the Chinese Xinhua agency. We will answer your questions in writing during the day. We take note of the questions you have raised, you have sent, and we will be able to respond to them in writing uh, during the day. And finally, Executive Secretary, do you have a final message? Yes, thank you once again to all of you for your presence, for your attention, for joining virtually. It is a very important subject. In sum, we did three things. We showed the international economic scenario, low dynamism of global growth, world trade of goods, which is very low, if not stagnated, high financial costs in global markets, among other characteristics. Also, we described a whole series of indicators regionally in the regional scenario with four key messages, I would say, that low economic growth continues with a rebound effect in 21 and 22. After that, we go back to this persistence of long-term trend of lower mediocre growth that is concerning and requires action. Low employment and gender gap, low investment in labor productivity, and limited fiscal and monetary space. But our call, and as Daniel said, is call to action. And this clearly means that it's not, I mean, you can light mm, uh, the world economy, you would want to ask for miracles that surely will not happen. So we need to do the homework. We need to assume these realities. And precisely, if there are bad news, well, we need to assume that as when in a family you have a difficult situation, you need to assume, take control, take action in order to improve the health or the economic situation or And thus, we recommend several things. Scale up productive development policies. No magic wand. It is a productive effort. Cluster initiatives. We are intensely working there. But indeed, we are convinced that much of the solution to raise dynamism comes from that productivity. All the policies to promote public and private investment with the same objective, expand monetary and fiscal space policies, and all of this would be benefited or facilitated where we need to work as a region in international fora in order to improve the financial international system and the international economy, but especially financial system, if there are possibilities to have an impact with the influence they have in Latin American countries, ministries of finance and governance of financial international institutions, in order to conduct reforms as the one raised by the Secretary General of the UN, and we have contributed to that, in order to have better schemes of debt restructuring, a more intense role of the International Development Bank, special drawing rights conditions, and other measures that could contribute to open the spaces of fiscal policy in the coming years. So the message is call to action. New purpose for 2024 is to intensely work in these lines in order to, in 1 year time, report better economic results. Thank you very much. Thank you, Executive Secretary, everybody who has been in this press conference, in this very important bridge we have to send our figures, our proposals to the different audiences of the region and the world. The media that have been with us. And in the webpage of ECLAC, we have all the information linked to this preliminary overview and of course willing and available for any other public information after this preliminary overview of the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean 2023. We have concluded this press conference and we'll see you soon in another meeting of ECLAC. Thank you very much, everyone.